People still seem to be coming in, but I think we'll start our welcome process. We're all so happy to see all of you. We wouldn't keep doing this for 6 years if you didn't keep coming, and we're a nice, wonderful turnout today. We take this opportunity. My name is Theron Dunn, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Festival Committee. And we take this opportunity, in addition to welcoming you, to thank our wonderful sponsors, which enable us to keep this festival free and open to our friends and our visitors. We've been very fortunate in having wonderful supporters through the years: Nantucket Island Resorts, Wendy Schmidt, the Nantucket Athenaeum, to whom we are, of course, most grateful today. This is the best place to be. The Inquirer Mirror, WCAI, which we have an excellent representative of today, Mindy Todd, who's going to be speaking with Dr. Jamison. We have In Magazine, Half Productions, the Nantucket Historical Association, where we always have events, and the Dreamland Theater, which is one of our prominent venues. The work that we do is year-round. We have the book festival is part of a book foundation, and we are grateful to all supporters we have. If anyone would like to make a donation, we have donation cards as you go out, and we also have a card that we'd like you to give us your email address so that we can keep you posted on what's going on. After Dr. Jamison's presentation, there will be book sales and book signing, which we hope you'll take advantage of. And I'm going to hand this over to Sarah Chutkowski, who is coordinator of clinical operations at Fairwinds, which is Nantucket's counseling service, who is going to introduce Dr. Jamison, and then she and Mindy will appear together as well. I think most of us here know that Mindy Todd is the managing director of editorial and the host and producer of The Point for the Cape and Islands NPR station, which we all listen to avidly. So turn off your cell phones, please. We thank you for coming, and enjoy the presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Chutkowski, and I am a clinical social worker by training, and I am a practicing psychotherapist and the coordinator of clinical operations at Fairwinds, Nantucket's counseling center. And I read my first book by Dr. Jamison when I was probably 19 years old, so having the privilege to introduce her today is honestly a little bit like meeting Beyonce. And much like Beyonce, Dr. Jamison is a triple threat. She is a world-renowned researcher, provider, and author. But I don't want to just read you her resume. I want to talk about something in her work that is deeply personal to me as a healthcare provider. So in my first session with patients, I always tell them that I have hope on their behalf, even if they don't have hope for themselves in that moment. And this very incredible woman who is about to come up on the stage today is the reason why. She is a shining example that having a mental health need does not mean that you are limited to the criteria of that particular diagnosis. And she is the reason that I can look my patients dead in the eyes and tell them with perfect sincerity that they have the capacity, as we all do, to make meaningful change in their lives. So, on that note, it is my distinct pleasure and honor today to introduce the world-renowned and very inspiring Dr. Kay Redfield Jamison.
Thank you. Lovely introduction. Thank you very much. I am really glad to be here. Simply delighted to be asked to talk here in Nantucket. I would like to thank both the festival organizers and also my host and hostess, Stephanie Cooper Greenberg and Erwin Greenberg, who are putting my husband Tom Trail and myself up and providing a wonderful courtesy. But last summer, Robert Lowell, as you know, or may or may not know, wrote an extraordinary poem when he was in his first book of poems that was almost, I would say, revolutionary in the nature of its influence, called The Quaker Graveyard in Nantucket. And Erwin and Stephanie invited Tom and me to come up to Nantucket, and neither of us had been here before, and showed us Lowell's haunts on the island. He spent 2 summers here. They were very, very influential when he was an adolescent. They were very influential in his decision to be a poet and how to go about it. So I'd like to thank them as well. So thank you very much. And I'd like to start with just a few remarks, and then we'll have an interview. And I think that the interview is probably going to focus quite a bit on mental illness. I have bipolar illness. I study it. I teach at Johns Hopkins, and I co-direct the Mood Disorder Center. So it's a large part of my intellectual, clinical, and personal life. And I understand that that's going to be a fair amount of the focus because depression and bipolar illness are very common disorders. They hit very young, unlike most other illnesses in medicine. In psychiatry, the psychiatric illnesses really hit first in late adolescence, early 20s. So I am glad to do that, but what I wanted to do was I've worked for 6 years on the work and life of Robert Lowell, who suffered from one of the worst forms of bipolar illness I've seen as a clinician. Very, very bad illness indeed, hospitalized about 20 times for severe mania. And I wanted to write a book as a tribute to him. I had read his poems when I was 17 after my first breakdown, and my English teacher in high school suggested I might get something out of his work, which I did, which I've used in teaching residents and medical students, but also in my own life. I've always been interested in how the relationship between Lowell's mania and depression and his writing, and his great, great writing, and also how he survived what he did. It's always an interesting question, I think, if you're a clinician, is why is it that some people can have a mild form of an illness and be done in and really essentially not get back into the fray of life, and others can have very, very severe forms of illness and get back in. And so I was very interested in the issue of character and discipline and will and courage. So the book is about illness a lot. It's mainly, overwhelmingly about Robert Lowell and his genius, but it's also about how you survive. So I want to start with 3 brief slides just to introduce you to how Robert Lowell looked. He was born in 1917. He died in 1977. Very intensely intelligent man, in addition to being a great poet. Next slide. And I'd like to just acknowledge his daughter's help. She allowed me to track down his medical and psychiatric records. She trusted me with manuscripts that had not been published, interviews, discussed her father and her mother, who's also a great writer, Elizabeth Hardwick. And I'd like to thank my husband, Tom Trail, who's here, he's a cardiologist and a professor of medicine at Hopkins, so he did actually the medical appendix to the book about Lowell's health and heart disease and what killed him and its intersection with bipolar illness. But he also greening my book, edited it to an extraordinary extent and improved it from a literary point of view as well as a clinical point of view. And he was just wonderful, so thank you. And I want to just end the slides with Robert Lowell. The subtitle of my book is called Setting the River on Fire. And just to give you a sense of who he was.
Reading myself.
Could you turn it up?
Like thousands, I took just pride, and more than just, struck matches that brought my blood to a boil. I memorized the tricks to set the river on fire. Somehow, never wrote something to go back to. And I suppose I'm finished with wax flowers and have earned my grass on the minor slopes of Parnassus. No honeycomb is built without a bee, adding circle to circle, cell to cell, the wax and honey of a mausoleum. This round dome proves its maker is alive. The corpse of the insect lives embalmed in honey, prays that its perishable work lived long enough for the sweet-toothed bear to desecrate this open book, my open coffin.
Thank you. You may be wondering where that accent came from, because Lowell, of course, was a Boston Brahmin, brought up in Boston and Mayflower family, and how on earth did it become so Southern? It became Southern because he rebelled against that upbringing, and he went south for a few years to study, and then to Kenyon College, and this accent remained with him for the rest of his life. So it's kind of a uniquely Boston something and Southern something. So I just want to read a few paragraphs to begin with, and then end up with a few paragraphs after the interview. Darkness honestly lived through is a place of wonder and life, Robert Lowell wrote. So much has come from there. It was October 1957, and he was 40, writing poetry like a house afire, as he put it, and taking darkness into new country. It was, he said, the best writing he had ever done, closer to what I know, and how welcome after 4 silent years. The new poems became the heart of life studies, perhaps the most influential book of modern verse since T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. The poems, written mostly at a boil in a few months' time, left their mark on poetry. They have made a conquest, wrote a reviewer. They have won a major expansion of the territory of poetry. In December 1957, after his summer and fall blaze of writing, Lowell was admitted to a mental hospital, severely psychotic. It was his 5th psychiatric hospitalization in 8 years. He told his doctor at the time that it was the best writing he had done, and that it was clearly related to his mania. This book is about fire in the blood and darkness. It is about mania and the precarious, deranging altitude to which mania ascends. It is about the poetic imagination and how mania and imagination come together to create great art. But it is as much and more about the vital role of discipline and character in making art from inborn gift. Poetry may come from an unhappy and disordered life, Lowell wrote, but a huge amount of health has to go into the misery. Without question, Lowell's attacks of mania spurred his work. They also brought incredible pain to him and to those he loved. Things he had done when he was manic haunted him when he was well. They were public, and they gave fodder to his competitors and his detractors. Yet Lowell came back from madness time and time and time again, re-entered the fray, and kept intact his friendships. He kept his wit, he kept his capacity to love, he went back to work. I have written a psychological account of the life and mind of Robert Lowell. It is as well a narrative of the disease that so affected him, manic depressive illness, now called bipolar illness. This disease of the brain bears down on all things that make us human: our moods, the way we see, the way we experience the world, the way we think, our changing capacities of energy, will, desire, imagination, the gift to create, our determination to live, our determination to die, our expectation of the future, our sanity. In short, my interest lies in the entanglement of art, character, mood, and intellect. Thank you.
Are they already on? Okay. And if you want to know more about Robert Lowell and Dr. Jamison's book, tomorrow at noon, her talk then will focus strictly on that book. Today we're going to talk about some of your other writings and work. And Sarah said something that I thought was really interesting in her intro, which was beautiful, by the way. She talked about hope. And speak a little bit about the importance of hope. And in your book, Unquiet Mind, you talk about you give us an insight on what it's like to have bipolar or manic depressive illness. But it also, I think, speaks to the families who have a loved one. So it's hope not just for the person with the diagnosis, but those around them.
Absolutely. And one of the things that is most characteristic of depression is the first thing to go is hope. So that people, even though they've been depressed before, even though they may have gotten well, hope just shadows everything. It's a horrible phenomenon. And so even if you know rationally that this is treatable, you somehow know it's an exception. So one of the things we try and teach residents and medical students, particularly psychiatric residents, is always extend hope, because these are illnesses. It's not any way deceptive to do that. These are treatable illnesses. They may be difficult to be treated, but you can always, in all honesty, extend hope. You may say, I don't think you're going to believe this for a minute to a patient. I don't think there's any way on God's green planet you're going to believe me, but I want to keep saying it because I believe it to be true. And patients will often say 6 months later, I was really angry when you said that. I really resented it because there was no way I believed that I would ever feel hope again. But I am glad you kept doing it because you believed it, and that transmitted itself. So it's a reasonable thing to do, is to extend hope. It's terribly important to do that to family members as well, because I think that one of the things that happens, and I certainly know my own family, my mother, who is like incredibly normal, I think never had an abnormal mood in her entire life, was a wonderful woman, but she hadn't a clue. She had a husband and 2 daughters with very bad bipolar illness. And, she wasn't brought up with that, that's for sure. And she had people who could extend hope to her, including my own doctor, who would say, look, it looks terrible. The trouble with depression is it's contagious. Moods are contagious. And so if you're sitting in the room with somebody who's contagious, whether it's a family member or a patient, it's going to spread. The hopelessness is going to spread. And you've got to, stand back.
How many have read An Unquiet Mind? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think what was so fascinating about that particular book is it really giving you some insight into what the person diagnosed is going through. Because I think it's really hard for us who've never suffered mania or severe depression to really understand what that's like. And I wondered, you talked about how common this diagnosis is now, and you talked about a lot of times the symptoms not really showing up until you're about college age. But we hear a lot now about kids much younger being diagnosed, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that. When we're seeing these symptoms in the 20s, could we have seen them earlier? Could they have been diagnosed earlier, or is there some controversy over that?
Well, there's a lot of controversy over the diagnosis of bipolar illness in children. There's no question that it exists, and there's no question that it's really, really important to get it right, because mania and depression damage the brain. So it's sort of like you don't want to keep having seizures or heart attacks. You don't want to keep having these massive electrochemical changes in the brain. So you want to get it right, and you want to protect kids, and you want to medicate kids if that's what they got. On the other hand, you for sure don't want to be medicating kids that don't need to be medicated. And some of the diagnoses that you see are really questionable. I mean, it's harder to diagnose. What we know is if you're an adolescent, the clinical pattern, the course of the illness, the treatment response is going to be very similar to the pattern in adults. So it's much more straightforward. So if somebody's 16, 17, 18 years old, it's generally a pretty straightforward diagnosis. There are exceptions, but they're generally straightforward. If you're younger, we know that it's a much more variable. So people who come into a child psychiatrist's office and having recurrent temper tantrums, on the one hand, versus kids who have genuine bipolar illness, can be difficult to sort out. And it's why you really want people who know what they're doing, diagnosing your kids. I mean, easier said than done, but you really want that because it's extremely important to get that one right. But I mean, I think the important thing is that that's a relatively small percentage of the onset of bipolar illness. So it's a good thing to focus on, but it's much more important to focus on what are the age of risk, starting 15, 16, 17, 18, and why don't we do more in our public schools to educate teachers, parents, kids about depression and bipolar illness, but particularly depression. Why don't we do that? And we don't do it very seldom, and not much excuse for it. I mean, parents learn about mondo bizarro diseases that nobody ever gets, and they obsess about it, and they take the kids to pediatricians and so forth. They don't learn the basic symptoms of depression.
When you wrote Unquiet Mind, you really exposed so much about yourself, and I wondered, yeah, it's like, what were you thinking? You have this burgeoning career, you really put a lot on the line. It was very brave, I think, for you to do that, but you were nervous, right, of what the reaction would be?
Well, sure. Yes, very nervous. I mean, I was, everything from being brought up as in a military family, a WASP and an Episcopalian, none of which makes you real eager to go out in public and talk about your personal life, to the fact that I had been completely mad as a hatter, and it was not like a mild form of the illness. I'd been delusional, I'd hallucinated, I had tried to kill myself. So that's kind of just the public aspect of total humiliation and stereotyping and so forth. The other side of it is I work in a medical school, and I have state licenses and licenses in the District of Columbia, and there are no guarantees about what your employer is going to do. And fortunately, Johns Hopkins absolutely backed me totally. But there was no guarantee on that, and they in fact went way beyond anything they had to do. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people have very strong feelings about the mentally ill, and I heard a lot of them, and a lot from the religious right, who really just thought I should burn in hell forever. Over and over and over again. There are a lot of things, colleagues who thought I should have kept quiet, that it was unseemly for a professor of psychiatry to be revealing myself on, public television shows and things like that. That was sort of embarrassing. My feeling is, get over it. I mean, the problem is that people aren't doing this. Mm-hmm. And when I went to the chairman of my department at Hopkins, I said, I don't want to put Hopkins in a bad position. I don't want to embarrass. I love this medical school. But the problem is that professionals keep quiet. So all of us who go out and get good treatment and respond well to treatment keep quiet. And all the people who don't get treatment or who don't respond well or don't get good treatment are out there for the public to see. And that just perpetuates everything. Mm-hmm, yeah. And he said, dead right.
Yeah. I talked about this when we did our radio interview, but I just want to read this little excerpt from the book, From an Unquiet Mind. My memories of the garden party were that I had a fabulous, bubbly, seductive, assured time. My psychiatrist, however, in talking with me about it much later, recollected it very differently. I was, he said, dressed in a remarkably provocative way, totally unlike the conservative manner in which he had seen me dressed over the preceding year. I had on much more makeup than usual and seemed to him too frenetic and far too talkative. He says he remembers having thought to himself, Kay looks manic. I, on the other hand, had thought I was splendid. And what I love about that is so that's got to be a scary feeling to go, wait a minute, I thought I was fabulous and I wasn't?
Oh, yeah, but welcome to Mania,
yeah,
sure.
Right.
It's like you think your ideas are just, unbelievable, and maybe 1 out of 3 million has some merit. You buy things that you think are of utter urgency. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, teaching at UCLA, and I was convinced that there was a rattlesnake problem in the San Fernando Valley, and that everyone I knew was going to need to be protected against the snakes, the coming snakes. This sounds very crazy. It was very crazy. And so I went, and actually as I was having my first prescription filled for lithium, I bought maybe 15 snake bite kits. And I could see the pharmacist, sort of putting it all together. This wasn't totally strange. But I also have to say, this is true. I mean, I'm not justifying being completely out of it, but that, maybe 5 years ago, the New York Times wrote an article about the rattlesnake problem in the San Fernando Valley. So I sent the article to my psychiatrist in Los Angeles. I said, I rest my case.
Your book, Night Falls Fast, is about suicide. Talk a little bit about how that book came about. That really came from conversations you had, mostly on college campuses, with young people about, an unquiet mind.
It came about a combination of things. One is my book tour for An Unquiet Mind went on and on and on. And at almost every public reading, somebody would come up to me with a photograph of a 15-year-old child or 17-year-old child or 20-year-old child who had jumped out of a window at college, blown their brains out with a gun. And I got involved. I mean, I had been involved in suicide research and certainly had done mental health advocacy, but I knew the statistics and all, but until you start really talking to people whose lives had just been ripped apart, and are never put the same again, it's a very different sort of thing. I had no intention of writing a book about suicide. I didn't have any desire to wake up in the morning to the topic of suicide and go to bed at night with the topic of suicide. I've been way too close to that myself, to say the least. And unlike writing about Lowell, I couldn't wait to get to work because I'd learned something and I loved it. Suicide, is really, really bleak, and it cut very close to the bone. And the students that I would talk to, I would go out and I would say, once the crowd thinned, talking to a group of students, I would say, how many of you have attempted suicide? All these hands would go up, and I'd say, how many of you talked to your parents about it?
Nobody.
Very few. These are kids under a lot of pressure. They don't want to disappoint their parents. They're ashamed of it. They don't think their parents will be any good. They don't want their parents interfering. I mean, for whatever reasons, the one time in their lives when they really should be reaching out to the parents and being actively involved, they pull back. Now, in some cases, obviously, they get help and so forth. But it was a devastating series of experiences and I talked to the Maryland chief medical examiner, and that's a real grim thing to do, to talk about suicide to a medical examiner. Okay.
I'm totally paraphrasing here, but you in an interview, somebody had asked you if you could go back and change it and not have bipolar disorder. You said you wouldn't change it. Tell us why.
I said I wouldn't change it with one big caveat. And that caveat is I respond really well to lithium. Lithium remains the gold standard for the treatment of bipolar illness. And if you're in the 60% of people who respond really well to it, it's as good as it gets in terms of treatment. I mean, it's just a really effective treatment. If lithium didn't work for me, I would not feel that way. And I feel it mainly, it's because it's who I am. My temperament is woven into my illness, to my experiences, who I am as a person. I don't want to turn my back on that. It's like turning your back on yourself. I mean, it's, and there's no doubt that at certain times in my life, I have enormously enjoyed it too much is part of the problem. But.
How about questions from the audience? Anybody have a question? It's right here. That's about
the question is, what percentage of people who have bipolar illness have a comorbidity with alcohol or drugs? And it's about 60% for bipolar 1, for the severe form of bipolar 1. So it's the highest comorbidity in psychiatry. So it's more common than not. People tend, although the intuitive notion would be that people tend to drink more when they're depressed. In point of fact, people with bipolar illness tend to drink more and really start drinking a lot when they're manic because they're wired and agitated and perturbed, want to sleep, want to pull themselves down. And so that is a real problem. Sometimes it's difficult to tease out because these kind of start happening about the same time. One thing that you want to look for, obviously, bipolar illness is very genetic. So you want to look for family history. You want to look for, did the mood disorder precede or follow the drinking problem? Sometimes people obviously have alcohol problems and you stop drinking and the depression goes away. If you've got bipolar illness, stopping drinking is not going to stop your bipolar illness. It'll make it less bad. But it's a very bad problem for a lot of reasons, aside from the chaos. It's very bad for the brain. It's very bad for sleep. It really messes up the whole psychology and cyclicity of the way the brain works. So it's a bad thing to be doing to the brain. You know, it's an understandable thing, but...
There was a question back here. Yeah, we'll go there and then there.
So I find your research question really interesting. And if character and discipline is so important to how one deals with this kind of illness, I'm wondering if it shouldn't be part of any kind of treatment, particularly for adolescents when they're still in the formative stages. And I'm wondering how that could be integrated, or if there's any research out there to be doing that.
The question is, what can you do something about discipline and character when people, other than just medication? I would say first and foremost, I would say at Hopkins, we tell the residents, you cannot tell anything about a personality disorder until you've treated the illness, okay? Because so many things in the illness that people do can look like a personality disorder. And until you get that cleared up, you can't make an accurate diagnosis. You've just got to work on the mood disorder. So there's an overlap in the clinical presentation with aspects of character. I think my concern, and one of the reasons I was drawn to Lowell, is that for a lot of people who have bipolar illness, perhaps in other aspects of life as well, not just people with bipolar illness, but particularly, they have drawn upon their life's experience to help them and help other people. That's a side of character that I think can be very, very helpful to people. In Lowell's case, what's fascinating to me is he was a pretty disturbed child long before he became overtly psychotically manic. He was really a problem child, would understate it by orders of magnitude. But what he always did as a child was he reached out to other people, to friends, and then eventually to teachers, and eventually to professors, but most particularly to history and to writing, to guide him. He saw very early on that he was just a stormy soul. And he went to Homer, he went to the Iliad, he went to the Odyssey, he went to Virgil, he went to the Roman poets, he went to all the modern poets, he went particularly to the New England writers. And with a belief in that kind of granite will. It's something we don't teach. I mean, I'm struck at university, talking to university kids, and a lot of it's wonderful. It's very heartening to talk to students, but it's dismaying to see how few of them have exemplars that are people that are lived more than 25 years ago. These are people, the notion of heroes, the notion of drawing upon the collective human experience is something I think in many ways has been overlooked in recent years. Lowell did it to an unusual degree. And he had icy discipline. And one of the things that's always very interesting to me in listening to his his students at Harvard who took his poetry classes was that, how deeply disturbed he was. This would not happen now, we might add. I mean, students would be protected from a psychotic professor. Probably a good thing, but they would have not been taught by Robert Lowell. But anyway, he would, at the end of most years, because he has a cyclic disease, become wildly manic and often taken away by police officers and, straitjackets and so forth. So traumatic for the students, for sure. And people tend to focus on that. What I find unbelievably admirable about Robert Lowell is that when he got out of a hospital, he showed up in his classroom again, okay? I mean, he didn't have to. He lived on a trust fund. He could live on a trust fund. He didn't have to come back into the classroom and face that, and he did. And he extended the remorse that he could. So that's where character comes in. It's a little like alcohol. I mean, some people never get around to the remorse stage. They don't get around to it. Lowell had to deal with that throughout his life. The humiliation, the terror that would come back. And one of the things that was striking to me in his medical records was over and over again to his doctors, the terror that his illness would come back. And it's one of the things I try and emphasize to the residents is, people talk about being frightened that cancer will come back, if they'll have another heart attack. People have no idea what it's like to live in terror that you'll go mad again. And that's something he learned to deal with.
There was right here, you want to wait for the microphone.
Thank you, Dr. Jamison, for writing An Unquiet Mind. My older brother is bipolar. He's now homeless as a result of his illness. But he's not medicated anymore. He doesn't like to take his medication, and we've all kind of wondered, why not? What's going on? Why are you doing that? But he's also very physically active. He was a bike messenger in Chicago for many years. And what is your thought on physical activity and versus medication? Should there be both, or should it be one or the other, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think just going at a sort of slightly more general level of, if you've got bipolar 1 illness, there's nothing to suggest that anything but medication is going to be the central critical treatment. Beyond that, the question is, what can you do? I think psychotherapy can be enormously helpful. If for no other reason, the problem you bring up is the central clinical problem with bipolar illness is people not taking their medication. So it doesn't do you any good to have a great medication or a good medication, effective medication, if people won't take it. So that's a different issue. Physical exercise is really important. We know that it has a very important impact on the brain in general. There are a lot of studies specifically with bipolar illness. It's not going to keep bipolar illness from coming back. And unfortunately, one of the things that happens when people get depressed is the last thing that anybody wants to do is go running or exercising. So it's problematic. I mean, it's a good thing to do, but it's not going to keep bipolar illness from coming back.
Right up here, she's waving. Hang on, we're going to bring you the microphone. Hang on 1 second. Carol, hang on, wait.
My daughter found that my granddaughter had it at age 3. She figured out that she had it. She was bipolar. She's now 13, and so, more diagnoses have gone along with that to kind of. But I was wondering, having caught that at such an early age, because if my understanding is correct, once you are bipolar, you're bipolar for life in a sense. You don't really get over it per se. You might go over large episodes of it, but you still have that disorder. But having caught it so early, will that be a help to her, as she gets older?
Well, a couple things. First of all, it doesn't go away. It's a recurrent illness. We know that if it's left untreated, it's very likely to get worse over time and more frequent and more difficult to treat. So that's, we have hundreds and hundreds of years of data on that one. So that's reasonably straightforward. I would have my usual qualification about anybody being diagnosed at 3, not that it's not true, but I would never take that diagnosis for life, just because there are too many uncertainties involved. Yes, of course, it's important to get it treated. It's very hard if you treat somebody who's 3 years old for bipolar illness and bipolar illness never occurs. It's very difficult to say, whether it's because they didn't have bipolar illness to begin with,
Well,
or,
she's been treated,
yeah.
she's been sectioned, and she's been pulled up
Ah.
and had to be carted up the island.
Oh, okay.
So, no, she's
So-
had episodes.
Oh, so, I thought you said it had worked very well.
She
Oh.
just realized it at age 3.
Mm-hmm.
And then as she got older, then it became more obvious. I should have qualified that.
Oh, I see. I thought you said that it, she responded, well, yeah,
Not
okay.
entirely diagnosed, but
Yeah.
as she got into school, then, then it became, but it was at a fairly young age is what I'm saying. That's the part that and then she has gone to, camps for
Right.
disorders and sort. And I just wondered how that, plays out later on in her life. Will this, intervention.
It's really hard to address an individual situation because, I mean, this is a very variable illness, and, I obviously don't know your granddaughter and so forth, so I couldn't address that. I would say that it's important to catch it early. It's important to get it diagnosed properly. And, at this point in time, treatment remains necessary. There's nothing that's been developed that's going to keep people from getting the illness if they stop treatment.
Right here in the front.
As a psychiatrist, I am disheartened by the change in the status of lithium as a primary treatment, the gold standard, as you say, versus Lamictal and atypical antipsychotics.
Yes, well, I am disheartened. The point is the fact that lithium, I think it's safe to say that lithium is non-patentable. There is absolutely zero profit motivation in it for the drug companies. And at some point, Abbott Laboratories did a series of studies on an anticonvulsant medication, which actually did work for a certain number of people. But at that point, the diagnosis became bipolar. It became a little bit more socially acceptable, probably in a not so great way. And lithium was seen as this kind of barbaric, ancient drug that really was primitive, and it was associated with, quote, manic depressive illness on the back wards. It was brilliant advertising, did a huge disservice in general, I think, to psychiatry, with the exception of the fact that there was a profit motivation in educating young doctors. So it did educate a generation of doctors about bipolar illness that would probably not have, because there wasn't any, huge, nobody's going to foot the bills for that. I think there are several of us who feel very strongly about lithium, and we go out and talk and advertise it and, point out the literature. I mean, the literature is really pretty straightforward, and the scientific clinical literature is pretty straightforward. So I appreciate it.
Since lithium is not used in clinical trials, I don't know whether for type 2 bipolar, if it's got the same efficacy.
With the milder bipolar 2 being depression with a history of mild mania, there are other drugs that seem to work reasonably well, but lithium certainly does, and certainly in a lot of cases, lithium is a good way of protecting against the kind of manic effects of some of the antidepressants. So it's in some of the clinical trials. One of the things that I think doesn't get emphasized enough about lithium is it's a very good protector against suicide. And this is, I think, where all of us are just waiting for a really good lawsuit where some psychiatrist has not written in his notes why he didn't consider using lithium in somebody with bipolar 1 and started using something else that doesn't have that kind of efficacy when you have a very high suicide rate in bipolar 1. So this is that aspect of lithium is particularly important as the anti-suicide.
And we're coming to the end of our time. I know you wanted to read a little more, so do you want to close with a reading?
Yes, just a very brief reading. Yes. So I just wanted to end with the last few paragraphs of my book. This is the centenary of Robert Lowell's birth in 1917. I might add the centenary of John Kennedy's birth and the centenary today of Katharine Graham's birth. So it was a good year for America. But it being the centenary, I wanted to read. My book starts off with Lowell's great-great-grandmother in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1845, with his great-great-grandmother being taken off to McLean Asylum for the insane. She died psychotic, and my book ends in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1978 in March. It was a memorial service for Robert Lowell at Harvard. A foot of snow lay on the ground outside the church, and the wind blew to the bone. It was winter in Cambridge. Had the mourners looked up at the bell tower of the church as they left the service for Robert Lowell on that March day, they would have seen the bell that tolled for him. But they would not have been able to see the words carved into the shoulder of the bell. Words for the dead, they had been chosen by Lowell's cousin nearly 50 years earlier when, as president of Harvard, he donated the bell to the college church. In memory of voices that are hushed, the bell read, in memory of the dead. The voices of the living could be hushed as well. Lowell's great-great-grandmother had lived a silent death in madness. Her son had said that only as much of her remained as the hum outliving the hushed bell. The poet's voice speaks for the dead, the hushed, the valorous. It signifies the hours, reminds of death. It gives depth and resonance to blithe times, solace in the dark. The bells cry, "Come, come home," Robert Lowell wrote. "Come, I bell thee home." Thank you. Thank you so much.
And once again, if you want to hear about her latest book, tomorrow at noon, she'll be talking about that. Thank you all.